A millionaire planned to humiliate his maid at a lavish gala, but what he didn't know? She was his half-sister, and she came armed with proof that would bring down his entire empire. Victoria Temp didn't show up for revenge. She came to expose the truth, demand justice, and rebuild everything on compassion and fairness. In front of reporters, judges, and California's elite, she revealed decades of embezzlement, blackmail, and murder. What began as a cruel joke turned into the biggest scandal Beverly Hills had ever seen. And you won't believe what happens next. The millionaire had invited the black maid as a joke. But when she arrived, she looked like a goddess, and everyone was stunned by who she truly was. The main hall of the Blackwood mansion in Beverly Hills burst into mocking laughter as Victoria Sterling descended the marble staircase. Her dress was worth more than what most people made in an entire year. But it wasn't laughter of admiration. It was sharp, scornful, and meant to humiliate. "Look who decided to make an appearance," Richard Blackwood whispered to his guests, raising his glass of Dom Perignon. "I'm your dear maid." Victoria, now 39 years old, never imagined she'd enter that ballroom as a guest, even if it was just part of a cruel joke. For 15 years she had cleaned every corner of that mansion, always silent, always unseen, watching the wealthy lie to each other with charm, while treating her like an object. She received the invitation only 3 days earlier, handed to her with a smile she knew all too well. "It's a charity gala this Saturday," Richard had said, slipping her a gold envelope. "Dress code is formal. I'm sure you've got something elegant in your closet, right?" Laughter erupted from his friends and echoed down the hallway. It was obvious, a trap designed to embarrass her in front of California's elite. Richard had even tipped off local reporters, hoping to capture what he called an educational moment. "You want to bet?" Richard said to his wife, Helena, as Victoria quietly vacuumed the study. $5,000 says she won't show." "And if she does?" Helena added with a wicked grin. "She'll be the night's entertainment." "With her terrible, Richard. She'll probably borrow something and feel so awkward she'll run out within 10 minutes. But Richard Blackwood didn't know two essential truths about Victoria Temps. First, she had once walked those marble floors as a child, long before she was paid to clean them. And second, not all storms come to destroy. Some storms come to teach you how to dance in the rain. As she moved through the corridor under a sea of mocking eyes, Victoria held her head high. Her posture was upright, her gaze calm, like a woman who carried within her the kind of secrets that could upend an empire. Her steps were smooth and steady, like each movement had been choreographed long ago. "Oh my God, she actually came," Patricia Weston, the senator's wife, whispered to her friend. "And look at that dress. Where on earth did she buy that?" Vivian Chambers, the oil heiress, sneered in response, masking her own fear with cruelty. "Probably rented it, paying in monthly installments. Pathetic." But what none of them knew was this. Victoria hadn't borrowed the dress, rented it, or bought it. She had reclaimed it, from a past that still existed, no matter how hard Richard had tried to erase it. Richard marched toward her, chest puffed, billionaires flanking him like bodyguards. His confidence was towering. After all, this was his show, a public exercise in status and social dominance. "Victoria," he said with artificial warmth, "what a pleasant surprise. I never doubted you'd come. When someone like you gets invited to an event like this." "Someone like me?" Victoria repeated, her voice slicing through the air like silk turned steel. "Go on, Richard, finish your sentence." For just a second, something in her tone made Richard hesitate. There was a steadiness in her voice that didn't belong to the compliant woman he remembered from the service halls. But arrogance quickly drowned out the moment. "Well, you know," Richard sneered. "A person like you doesn't usually attend events like this. You must feel out of place surrounded by all this elegance." Victoria smiled. Not a timid smile, but a dangerously calm one that made a few nearby socialites stop mid-laugh, sensing something they couldn't explain. With quiet intensity in her eyes, she leaned slightly forward and said, "No, Richard, I feel like I'm exactly where I've always belonged." Silence followed. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to shift the entire atmosphere of the evening. Something about the way Victoria spoke, the way she moved, the sheer authority in how she claimed space, it forced everyone to reassess their assumptions about who she was supposed to be. Richard cleared his throat, his confidence faltering. "Well, I hope you enjoy the evening. I'm sure it'll be enlightening for you." "Oh, I'm certain it will be enlightening for all of us," Victoria replied, her eyes slowly scanning the guests, as though imprinting every face in her memory. If you're enjoying this story of justice and redemption, don't forget to subscribe, because these entitled elites have no idea that Victoria carries with her a devastating truth, one that will turn this carefully planned night of humiliation into the most unforgettable lesson in Beverly Hills history. Richard was pleased, at first. She hadn't run away in shame like he expected, but there was something about her stillness, her strange, composed poise that began to make him uneasy. "Everyone," Richard said, tapping a silver spoon against his glass to get the room's attention. "I'd like to introduce our guest of honor, Victoria, our faithful maid." Laughter erupted in waves, echoing through the marble halls. Phone flashes lit up the space as guests eagerly captured the moment, eager to post snide captions on their social media accounts. Helena leaned over to Richard, her voice tight with concern. "Don't you think you're being a little cruel?" "Cruel?" Richard scoffed. "I'm giving her the only chance she'll ever have to attend something like this." Victoria stood perfectly still in the center of the room, all eyes fixed on her. But the humiliation they expected to see was nowhere to be found. Instead, her expression was unsettlingly calm, like someone who had already survived far worse. Patricia Weston, full of arrogance, strolled over with a smirk. "Darling Victoria," she sneered, "how long did it take to find that dress? Must have been hard to find something that fits the occasion." "Actually," Victoria replied smoothly, causing Patricia to pause, "this dress has a rather special history. It was my mother's." "Her mother?" Vivian Chambers scoffed. "What? Did she get it from a fancy thrift shop?" Victoria's smile sharpened. "No. She wore this dress the last time she attended a ballroom like this 40 years ago, back when she was still Isabella Blackwood and I was still Victoria Blackwood." The room froze. Even the laughter stopped. Richard, who had been chuckling with his friends, slowly turned to face her. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice suddenly low. "Blackwood by blood," Victoria repeated, her voice slicing through the room like glass. Strange how some people find it convenient to forget their own family history. Richard's complexion turned a shade paler. Helena instinctively clutched his arm, her body tensing. "You're insane," Richard muttered. "I don't know what game you're playing." "This isn't a game, Richard," Victoria said, stepping forward. Guests instinctively moved aside, as if making way for something unstoppable. "This is history, our history, the history you buried the day you decided it was easier to pretend we never existed." Camera phones were still filming, but now for a very different reason. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Helena gripped Richard's sleeve. "What is she talking about?" "She's lying," Richard snapped, but there was a slight tremor in his voice now. "She's a delusional maid craving attention." Victoria calmly opened her small purse and pulled out a single object that made the crowd gasp. A ring, not just any ring, but the Blackwood family's heirloom engagement ring, etched with the family crest and crowned with a brilliant blue sapphire passed down through generations. "This ring," Victoria said, holding it up high, "was given by my mother to my father, Henry Blackwood." "Your father?" She turned to Richard. "The man you claim died childless?" Richard's eyes widened. "Where did you get that? How dare you? How dare you steal—" "You can't steal what was yours from birth," Victoria replied coldly. Patricia Weston turned to Vivian, whispering, "Oh my God, could she be telling the truth?" "No way," Vivian replied, but her confidence had vanished. "Richard would have told us if he had a half-sister." Victoria looked directly at them, her voice calm and direct. "Half-sister? No, sweetheart. Not just any cousin. She turned to Richard again. "I am your half-sister." Gasps erupted. The room filled with murmurs and uneasy glances. Richard looked like he'd been struck. "That's ridiculous," he stammered. "My father would never—" "Henry Blackwood had an affair with my mother, Isabella," Victoria said, her voice unrelenting. "She was the family's piano teacher. When she became pregnant with me, your father promised to support us. And he did, until the day he died." Elena raised a trembling hand to her mouth, staring at both of them like she was watching a slow-moving disaster. "You," Victoria said, pointing directly at Richard, "cut off our support. You sold the house your father bought for my mother and left us to rot." "I wasn't obligated," Richard began. "You weren't obligated to care for your own father's blood," Victoria interrupted, her voice fierce but composed. Interesting perspective, especially from someone who inherited 100% of the estate that should have been shared. The weight of her words began to settle over the guests like a heavy fog. Some began to quietly move away from Richard, as if being near him might implicate them in the scandal. "Prove it," Richard said, desperation creeping into his voice. "Anyone can make up a story and flash a ring." Victoria's eyes gleamed. "Oh, Richard, do you really think I came here without proof?" She raised her phone and motioned to someone waiting at the ballroom entrance. "They can come in now?" With every insult Richard had hurled at her, he unknowingly added fuel to something inside Victoria, something deeper than anger. A quiet, implacable strength had been growing all along, in direct response to every injustice he thought she'd silently endure. The man who thought himself untouchable didn't realize that every act of cruelty was writing a sentence against his own name. And Victoria had spent 20 years learning how to collect a debt that went far beyond money. Then 3 people entered the ballroom, and their arrival would change every life in that room forever. The first was Diane Morrison, Beverly Hills' most respected investigative journalist. The second was David Chun, a leading attorney in estate and inheritance law. But the third made Richard Blackwood reel as if he'd been punched. "Sir Hamilton," Helena whispered, stunned, recognizing their family's long-time private physician. "What are you doing here?" Dorman stepped into the spotlight, his hands trembling, but his voice steady. "Years ago, I was coerced into signing a falsified death certificate. Henry Blackwood didn't die of natural causes. He was slowly poisoned over the course of several months with arsenic." Gasps and muffled cries filled the hall. Deanne raised a hand. "Please refrain from using your phones. This is a formal legal confession being documented." Richard, now sweating and visibly shaken, snapped. "You're insane, Hamilton. My father died of heart disease." "Your father found out you were embezzling funds from the company," Dr. Hamilton continued, unwavering. "Revised his will to include Victoria and planned to call the authorities right before he started showing strange symptoms." Victoria stood quietly, eyes glistening, as years of silence were finally broken. David Chun opened his briefcase and held up an official lab report. The blood sample was analyzed by an independent forensic lab last week. The arsenic levels were high enough to be fatal. "This is a setup," Richard screamed, his voice cracking. "You're trying to destroy me." Diane calmly stepped forward. "Mr. Blackwood, we have transcripts of 5 separate calls between you and Dr. Hamilton, from to where you threatened to ruin his career." Then Victoria spoke, her voice like steel slicing through chaos. "Richard, you didn't just kill our father. You stole 20 years of my life." "I didn't kill anyone," he shouted, pointing wildly around the room. "They're all lying." "Then explain this," Victoria said, pulling out her phone. She connected it to the estate speaker system, and a recording began to play. Richard's voice was unmistakable. "Hamilton, you better stay quiet about anything strange in that old man's blood. If you open your mouth, I'll make sure you never practice medicine again. And that woman and her bastard child, they can fend for themselves." The room was dead silent. Even Richard's most loyal allies stepped away, as if he were radioactive. Helena stared at her husband in disbelief. "Richard, did you really do this for 20 years?" 20 years, Victoria shouted, her calm cracking. of scrubbing blood from the hands of the man who killed my father." She took a breath and regained her terrifying composure. "Do you want to know how I got all this evidence? I didn't just happen to work here. I applied for this job with a purpose. I spent years preparing in close, collecting, documenting." Richard tried one last pathetic excuse. "Even if any of that were true, it doesn't matter. The inheritance was settled years ago." For the first time, David Chun smiled. "Actually, Mr. Blackwood, under California law, when there's evidence of murder, any estate may be restructured according to the original will. And we have a verified copy of Henry Blackwood's true will." Victoria stepped closer to Richard, now slumped against the wall like a cornered animal. "Do you know what my biggest mistake was, Richard? Believing you could change." "Please," Richard whispered, all arrogance gone. "Helena, the kids, this will destroy everything." "No, Richard," she said coldly. "You destroyed everything the moment you chose greed over justice." Richard collapsed into a chair, defeated, humiliated, exposed. In less than 2 hours, the man who once ruled over others had fallen from untouchable millionaire to disgraced criminal. Victoria looked at him one last time. He was broken, but this was only the beginning. What Richard didn't yet realize, and what he'd soon discover in the most public, humiliating way possible, was that Victoria had built an airtight case. She hadn't just collected evidence of murder. She'd unearthed decades of financial crimes, extortion and corruption. She created a web of justice so intricate that his downfall would be studied. The next 2 hours transformed the most luxurious party in Beverly Hills into the most talked-about scandal in California elite history. Richard, once untouchable, now sat on the ballroom floor, back against the wall, watching his empire crumble in real time. Diane Morrison connected her laptop to the estate's projection system. On the massive screen appeared documents, images, and recordings. "This," Diane said, pointing to the first file, "is a card transfer from Richard Blackwood's personal account to Yar Hamilton made 3 days after Henry Blackwood's death." The note on the transfer read, "Silence is golden." Helena, now seated on the opposite side of the room, as far from her husband as she could manage, cried silently, processing 20 years of lies. "And this," Dion continued, "is a recording of Richard's conversation with his accountant, discussing how to conceal company embezzlement." Richard's voice echoed across the room, haunting every corner of the mansion he once ruled. "I need you to make the numbers dance," Richard said, his voice panicked. "If anyone finds out I've withdrawn $10 million over the past 6 years, I'll go bankrupt. Blame market volatility, expansion costs, whatever you have to do." Patricia Weston whispered to her friend, "Oh my God, he stole from his own company." Victoria remained at the center of the room, calm, unmoving, the eye of the storm watching the man who murdered her father unravel with every revelation. David Chun stepped forward, holding a new set of documents. "Mr. Blackwood, in addition to the criminal charges, I must inform you that Ms. Temp is filing a $50 million civil lawsuit for wrongful death and stolen inheritance." "$50 million?" Richard muttered, his eyes hollow. "I don't have $50 million." "No," Victoria replied softly. "But your company is worth $100 million, and half of it has always been mine by law." Diane Morrison continued her presentation, delivering one blow after another. "We also have evidence that Richard Blackwood blackmailed local politicians, bribed at least 3 judges, and funneled charitable donations into personal accounts for 5 consecutive years." With every new slide, gasps rippled through the guests. The ones who had arrived as Richard's allies now stood apart, avoiding eye contact like he was contaminated. "Victoria," Richard's voice cracked. "Please. You've won, isn't that enough?" Victoria stepped forward and knelt in front of him, her gaze steady and piercing. "You murdered our father. You robbed my family of our future, our name, our dignity. You made me wipe the blood off your hands for 2 years and pretend it wasn't there." "I can pay you back," Richard whispered, clinging to desperation. You can't pay for 20 years of injustice, Victoria said with eerie calm. But there are still consequences. Elena's phone rang. It was one of their children calling from college. Mom, is it true? Are people saying Dad's a murderer? Helena looked at her husband with absolute disgust. Their children were learning about their father's sins on social media. Richard tried to rise but fell to his knees. Helena, please, think of the kids. Don't you dare mention our children, Helena shouted, her voice silencing the room. You've humiliated them forever. Dr. Hamilton approached Victoria. I've contacted the police. Richard Blackwood will be arrested today on charges of murder. And fraud, and blackmail, and tax evasion, Victoria added. L will spend the rest of his life in prison. She turned to the crowd, all of whom were staring at her with a mix of awe and guilt. Let me make something clear. I didn't do this for revenge. I did this for justice, for every person crushed by men like Richard Blackwood. Patricia Weston stepped forward timidly. Victoria, we're so sorry. We didn't know. You knew, Victoria said plainly. You laughed. You watched. The only difference now is that I have more money than you. Sirens echoed from outside. The police had arrived. Richard looked up at her, hollow and trembling. You ruined my life. No, Victoria said, rising. You ruined your own life the moment you chose evil. I just made sure the truth came out. As officers moved in and cuffed him, Victoria stepped out onto the balcony. Dozens of cameras and reporters waited. The story had already gone viral. Helena joined her. Victoria, I didn't know. I believe you, Victoria said softly. You were his victim too? What happens now? Now, Helena, Victoria looked out over the glittering city. Justice is done. Maybe Beverly Hills will finally learn that class has nothing to do with money. As Richard was escorted down the hallway where he once tried to humiliate her, Victoria finally felt something she hadn't in 2 decades. Peace. But Richard didn't yet realize this was just the beginning. In prison, he would learn that Victoria had spent years documenting not only his crimes, but rebuilding her own life. The Blackwood Empire had a new heir, one who would use power to protect the very people Richard had trampled. 6 months later, Victoria Temp Blackwood stood inside Richard's former office, completely transformed. The trophies of arrogance had been replaced by certificates of community projects and photos of workers promoted from janitorial to executive roles. Richard Blackwood was sentenced to life in prison, with no chance of parole. His crimes: murder, corporate fraud, blackmail, and tax evasion. His entire fortune was seized and redistributed to compensate the victims. Victoria had been one of many. Temp Blackwood, said Amanda, her new executive assistant, once a janitor in the same building. Forbes magazine wants an interview about how you've transformed the company. Victoria smiled. In just 6 months, she had increased company profits by 30%, simply by treating employees like people. Fair pay, real promotions, a respectful workplace. It created a kind of productivity Richard never achieved with fear. Helena divorced Richard and moved out of state with their children. Before leaving, she met Victoria to apologize. You had every reason to destroy us, Helena said, weeping. But you protected my kids. I'll never forget your grace. Children shouldn't pay for their parents' sins, Victoria replied. They deserve a better future. Normal to the extent that Enhale began importing medical consultants, offering free care to all staff. I never thought I'd find the courage to do the right thing, he told her. But you taught me it's never too late to reclaim your dignity. Patricia Weston and Vivian Chambers attempted to reconnect, but Victoria kept her distance. You laughed when you thought I was beneath you. Now you want to be friends because I'm rich? That says everything. Her story spread worldwide. She was invited to speak at Ivy League schools on leadership and justice, but Victoria declined most interviews. I don't want to be known for suffering, she once said. I want to be known for what I built afterward. Under her leadership, the company sponsored scholarships, created credit programs for underserved entrepreneurs, and established California's largest domestic violence fund. One quiet afternoon, Victoria received a letter from prison. It was from Richard. "Victoria, I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know. You taught me what kind of monster I became. I spend every day trying to understand how I killed my own father for money. The kids asked about you during their last visit. They want to meet the aunt who protected the family when their father failed them." Victoria held the letter for a long time. She didn't reply. Forgiveness is personal. But justice had been served. In a rare interview, a Forbes journalist asked her, "Some say what you did was revenge. Was it?" "Revenge would have been doing to him what he did to me," Victoria answered. "Justice means ensuring he pays for his crimes and that no one else suffers what I did. There's a difference." "And what advice would you give to people facing injustice?" Victoria looked out the window, watching her employees eat lunch in a garden built just for them. The best revenge isn't destruction. It's building something so good, so lasting, that the injustice becomes just the first chapter of a story worth celebrating. That night, Victoria returned home, not to the tiny apartment where she once dreamed of justice, but to a warm home filled with life. She had adopted 2 orphaned girls, both in need of a second chance. She helped them with homework. She thought of the father she never truly knew, but who lived on in her blood. Henry Blackwood would be proud. His daughter not only reclaimed what was stolen, she turned an empire built on cruelty into a symbol of fairness and dignity. Victoria's greatest victory wasn't destroying Richard. It was proving that when you build power on justice, not fear, that power multiplies and uplifts everyone it touches. Richard tried to humiliate a maid. He didn't realize he was underestimating a woman, and what he learned too late was that dignity can't be bought, inherited, or stolen. It's earned by the choices we make when no one is watching. If this story moved you, subscribe for more real justice stories. Because with the right strategy, sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one you never saw coming. Victoria's story ends, not with revenge, but with transformation. And in many ways, that's where the real story begins. Because while Richard Blackwood was led away in handcuffs, what Victoria built in the aftermath revealed something far more powerful than a courtroom victory. It was a testament to the strength of the human spirit, and a reminder that legacy is not written in bloodlines, but in choices. Watching this narrative unfold feels like watching a modern fable, one where the villain is not just a man, but a system. A system built on arrogance, wealth, elitism, and unchecked power. But just as importantly, it's a story about grace, and how even the most wounded souls can choose dignity over destruction. What Victoria shows us is that justice doesn't always wear a black robe or swing a gavel. Sometimes, justice looks like a woman standing tall in a room full of people who once dismissed her, and proving them all wrong. One of the most moving things about this story is how it redefines power. Richard believed power came from intimidation, wealth, and control. But in the end, it was Victoria's patience, resilience, and long-game strategy that brought him down. She didn't raise her voice to be heard, she raised the truth. That's a lesson in quiet strength we don't see enough of, especially in stories that deal with trauma and injustice. She could have chosen the path of revenge, and frankly, no one would have blamed her. But she chose the harder route, to rebuild, to correct, to create something better. That is not just noble, it is revolutionary. Victoria's transformation of Blackwood Industries from a toxic empire into a compassionate, inclusive organization wasn't just symbolic. It was deeply personal. Every policy she introduced was the opposite of what Richard once enforced. And that contrast drives home one of the most profound lessons in the story. Leadership is not about authority, it's about responsibility. True leaders lift others. They don't trap them beneath their own ego. By implementing fair wages, mental health support, educational programs, and ethical business practices, Victoria became what her father never got to be, a builder of legacy, a protector a nurturer of human dignity. But perhaps the most poignant moment comes from the small, quiet scenes. The moment Victoria adopts two orphan girls, giving them the future she once dreamed of but never had. The moment she forgives Helena, not with grand words, but with grace. And the moment she reads Richard's prison letter and decides that forgiveness, while not owed, is possible. These moments matter. They show us that justice and healing can coexist, that you can fight fiercely for what is right and still soften your heart to what is human. The story also asks us to think about family, not just by blood but by action. Richard's greatest failure wasn't that he denied Victoria's identity. It was that he chose greed over kinship. In contrast, Victoria chose protection over pettiness. She fought not only for her father's legacy, but for the children of the man who tried to erase her. That is what family looks like at its highest form. Not perfect, not easy, but redemptive. Her belief that children shouldn't be punished for their parents' sins offers a powerful counterpoint to generational bitterness. It's a call to break cycles, not repeat them. As a cinematic narrative, the pacing of this story follows a flawless sine wave. There are emotional highs, like the reveal of Victoria's lineage and the moment she takes over the company, and crushing lows, like the flashbacks of betrayal, the discovery of the poisoning, and the cruelty she endured in silence. The rhythm allows us to breathe with the story, rage, weep, and ultimately feel inspired. Every chapter serves a purpose. Every choice reflects a character arc that is organic, earned, and deeply human. As viewers or readers, we come away not just entertained but changed. Because this story is not just about one woman's fight. It's about systemic injustice and the courage it takes to challenge it from the inside out. It's about what happens when someone who was supposed to disappear into the shadows chooses instead to become the light. And it's about reminding us that the most dangerous kind of hero is the one no one saw coming. In a world that often celebrates surface-level success, Victoria's story is a bold rejection of that. It's a declaration that character matters more than charm, that integrity is louder than wealth, and that silence, when weaponized against injustice, can become a force louder than any scream. What makes this story so enduring is that it doesn't end in a courtroom or a press conference. It ends in a garden where employees once silenced are now seen. It ends in a letter from a broken man trying to understand his own fall. And it ends in a quiet home where two orphaned girls are given not just shelter but hope. That's the kind of ending that stays with you. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's real. Because it reminds us that the best endings aren't the ones that punish evil. They're the ones that grow something beautiful in its place. In many ways, Victoria Temp Blackwood isn't just a character. She's a mirror held up to all of us asking, what will you build after the storm? What will you do when power is finally in your hands? Will you repeat what broke you, or will you create what heals others? This story invites us to believe that transformation is not just possible, it's necessary. That justice isn't a single moment, but a series of courageous choices. And that maybe, just maybe, the best revenge is building a world where people like you never have to fight for dignity again.